Okay, so today we're going to work on turning the laser cut acrylic mold that you've made on the laser cutter and turning it into an actual plastic mold injection mold that you will be able to use with the plastic mold injector. So to do this, what you're going to need is you're going to need to go ahead and have every single piece of acrylic that was cut by the laser. And so that means all of the kind of pieces that will kind of stack together and look like your 3D model, but it also means all of the pieces that were actually cut out. And so that should seem fairly obvious for these large pieces, but where it can get tricky is, for example, where we kind of laser cut this spot for the key ring, you're actually going to need those small pieces. And so do be careful about watching all the tiny pieces. You need every single piece because ultimately, so this is called the positive. This is what your object is going to look like, but your mold itself is going to be the negative. And so you need all of those tiny pieces that were cut out so that you can actually have a mold to inject into. And so again, as you're laser cutting, just be careful to keep track of all of your pieces. You can see from this one that I've pre-assembled that our model, or rather our mold, is going to come in 3 pieces. Okay, so we have kind of our bottom plate, and with this you can kind of see all those interior pieces for my keychain. And you can also see that on that bottom plate I've got these tiny little holes, and that's where that pressure is going to be able to escape. The second part is the walls. Okay, and this is a separate piece, and this is we keep this separate from the top and bottom plate to help demolding be a little bit easier. And then the last part is our top plate, and you can see with this that we just have a single hole there, and that's for the plastic from the mold injector to be able to make its way into the mold. So that's what I'm gonna work on showing you how to build today. Now, what we are using to put all this together is super glue. This is just from the dollar store. These are single use, so once you kind of open them up, there's no way of sealing them up. So just make sure that when you open one of these up that you've got everything that you need so that you can kind of work efficiently and you just don't waste any of the super glue. So to start off, we're gonna start with the bottom plate. And one of the trickiest things about the bottom plate is just kind of figuring out what the orientation is, like which way is this, relative to the rest of the model. So what we're going to do is I'm going to grab one of these kind of intermediate plates, and I'm going to put it on here and just kind of rotate it around. And what we should see is that these tiny little holes should be oriented such that all of them fall within the body of the model. And so if I rotate it like this, I can see that, in fact, each of those holes has access to it. Okay. So once I have that, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to build my wall plates first. So that's going to kind of let me sort of stack these up. Okay. And one of the most important things is that you keep the plates as square to each other as possible. So if you have them like offset slightly, and I'm kind of exaggerating that for this, but if you were to mold this, when you go to try to demold, it's going to be really difficult to kind of pop that out because it's going to get caught on these edges. And so we have this kind of oriented correctly, but we're going to go ahead and start to square up these edges as much as we can. So the way that we do that is we take our super glue, okay, and we screw on the cap, and once you screw it on tight enough, it'll actually will puncture the seal and you'll hear it go psh, just for a little bit. Okay. And with the super glue, what we want to do is just put a nice dab in each of these corners. Okay. We're going to grab our other piece, and again, we want to make sure that this is straight as possible. You can feel the inside edges to make sure that they feel nice and smooth. Okay, and you can press down and you'll see that super glue spread out. And I'm just going to keep constant pressure here for about 30 seconds just to give it a nice, good, solid tack. Okay, so that's about 30 seconds. And I can tell that it's got pretty good adhesion because when I lift up, I don't see kind of these bubbles changing at all. So they seem like they're pretty solid. Okay, so that's our first plate. So for our next plate, we're just going to repeat that again. So again, just a small blob of glue in each of these. And again, we're going to grab that next plate, line it up. Okay, and again, I'm going to feel around all those edges to make sure it is as smooth as possible, and press down for another 30 seconds. Okay, so I think we're all glued up there, so you can see that we've got a nice solid wall plate going on. And so the next thing that we're going to do is, ideally we want to be able to kind of position these small pieces onto this plate so that, you know, we get them, you know, nice and glued down to this bottom plate. But what we need to figure out is, where do they need to be positioned? And this is where it's going to be helpful to have these wall plates and also these positive mold pieces glued up, because that's going to help us kind of get things positioned. And so the next step that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and glue up our positive mold. And what that will do is, once we drop it in here and we put it on the bottom plate, it'll help us position all these kind of tiny little pieces to where they need to go. So just like before, we're going to take our pieces, and we want to be a little careful here that we don't kind of get glue pouring out over the side. You know, especially for this positive piece, this is just temporary. This isn't actually going to be part of the final molding process. But once again, it's important to get it as straight as you can and hold for 30 seconds. Okay, so, and then we'll do the final layer. And so mine's a 3-layer design, so yours may be thicker, thinner, just depending on what it is that you designed. Mine's 3. Again, just being really careful, feeling around all those edges, making sure that it's nice and smooth. And another 30 seconds. Okay, so looks like we've got our positive piece all up now, and you can see how nice and straight into that, because it falls right in. So that's great. Okay, so now the next part that we need to do is we're going to start working on gluing these pieces to our bottom plate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and line up the bottom plate with the exterior walls. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tape these edges just a little bit, because if this shifts around a lot, I'm going to have some serious issues when it comes to molding. So I'm going to grab just a few strips of painter's tape. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that the walls are lined up nice and straight, and then just wrap it around. And this is just going to be temporary, so it doesn't have to be super pretty, just enough to keep that plate from wiggling around too much while we glue in the rest of this. Like I said, if it shifts at all, then it's going to cause some problems for the alignment. You may get, you know, pretty rough edges when it comes time to do the molding. Okay, so again, not the prettiest work, but it is straight, which is good. Okay, so what we're gonna do, we're gonna take our positive piece and we're gonna drop it in. Okay, and now what we want to do is we're just gonna build up these interior pieces just piece by piece. So to start off with, I'm just gonna put a nice blob of glue here and drop that piece in. Okay, and I'm just going to build this up 3 layers. Okay, do make sure that you don't have your pieces accidentally reversed or anything like that. That would be bad. Okay, so I've got all those 3 in there. And again, you want to be very careful about using too much glue. You don't want that to seep out the side and glue itself to your positive mold. That would be bad. This positive mold is gonna pop out when we're done here. So just be careful not to use too much glue, enough to kind of hold on to it, but not so much that it oozes out and glues itself to other pieces. Okay, so that should be done at the moment. What I'm going to do next for these smaller pieces, since these are pretty small, I'm going to go ahead and kind of glue them up outside the mold to start with. And again, with these, they're very small, so they don't need very much glue at all. So I'm just going to keep pressure here for a few seconds. You can see I got a little bit of glue on my fingers, that's okay. So we'll scrub off. And then I'm going to add just the smallest amount of glue to the bottom here. And I'm going to drop it into that hole and just keep pressure on that for about 30 seconds. Okay, so everything should be tacked into place. So what we can do is we can go ahead and we can pull off the packing tape, or the painter's tape rather. Okay. Hopefully everything that should stick together will stay stuck together, and hopefully everything that should come apart will come apart. So we'll see how we did. Okay, so if I go ahead and lift this up, okay, we should be able to kind of take this guy out. Good. Okay. And so you can see that we've got our interior space right here. Okay, and that lines up nicely with that. And then we've got our top plate, which is going to line up there, and you can see where that plastic is going to be able to get injected in here and fill this negative space. And once it cools down, we should be able to pull it apart and extract our injected piece. So that's done for the mold. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take it over to the plastic mold injector, and we're going to work on how to actually inject into this piece. All right, so now we're going to go over on how to actually use the plastic mold injector. So there's a number of kind of just tools that you're going to need to kind of assemble together into one place. And once you get going with this process, you don't want to be kind of running to the other side of the lab to try to kind of find something. So make sure that you kind of get everything all in one place. So what we've got is the plastic mold injector, and notice that it does have a screw cap on the end. That's going to be important. You want to make sure that that's on it. If not, go find it. You want a plastic bucket. You want the mold that you just put together in the previous step. You want the injector plate. You want the shredded plastic that you've processed, and you're going to want about twice as much as you calculate that you'll need for this. There's some empty space in the mold that's going to be filled with it, so make sure that you have lots of extra for doing the actual mold injection. Finally, you're going to have some mold release spray, some channel lock pliers, these thermal resistant gloves. This thing does get incredibly hot, so safety is going to be important. You want to make sure that you've got safety glasses, a couple of quick grip clamps, so we've got 3 of those, and a flathead screwdriver. Okay. So to get started, what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and turn on the mold. Now this does create fumes, and so you'll notice that we are kind of doing this outside the lab. So do this outside the lab because you don't want to inhale any of those fumes. And what you can do is make sure it's plugged in and flip on the power switch here. And when you do, you will see that there's going to be these 2 displays on the end here that should read about 270 degrees Celsius. And that's going to actually start to heat up the hot ends here. And so we want to let those go ahead and get hot. While that happens, what we need to do is we need to apply the mold release spray to our molds. This is going to put a light coating on those plastic parts to make sure that we are able to demold our mold a little bit more easily. As you're working around this, just be aware that this gets extremely hot, and so you want to avoid any burns by accidentally touching that. By avoiding accidentally touching that. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 3 pieces, okay, and I'm going to lay them out, and I'm going to coat all the pieces that are going to be exposed to the plastic, so all the inside pieces. I'm actually going to do this away from the hot end. You don't want to spray aerosols over there, so I'm going to bring this over here. And following the instructions on the bottle, it says to hold it about 12 inches away and just do a light coating. Then you're going to let that sit for just a few minutes, and then you're going to recoat 1 additional time. Just nice light coats. And also notice how we're doing that in the bucket to just try to avoid any overspray if at all possible. As this heats up, you will notice that it's going to start smoking a little bit. That's just burning off excess plastic. Again, that's one of the reasons why we want to do this outside in the first place. As it does, I'm going to go ahead and throw my safety glasses on. And you do want to be careful. Like, if you start to notice things sparking or catching on fire, that's going to be an indicator that something may be wrong. You might want to flip off the injector, and if something's on fire, blow it out or grab the fire extinguisher. But if it's just smoking, that's normal. Sparks and fires, not normal. You want to put that out. So while that dries, I'm just going to go over some kind of basic operation with this. And so on this, there is a toggle switch that will actually actuate this injector rod. And so what that's going to do is we're going to load the plastic into this space here and actually use the linear actuator to force the plastic out of this hot end. And so once we kind of get everything up to temperature, we'll start loading the plastic in and allow that to heat. We want to make sure that that gets to a nice liquidy state before we inject anything in. If it's not warm enough, it's not going to be able to be extruded. So you can check on the temperature on these dials. So at the moment, the dial on the left is reading 270, so that's really good. The dial on the right is reading 370, and that's not good. So it's actually a little bit hotter than what we want it to be, and that's okay. So these black dials here are actually thermal regulators, and what they'll do is when it gets too hot, it'll cut the heat to the electric band heaters and allow them to cool down. So it's going to try to heat it up to the right point, but it might overshoot it and it'll let it cool down. And after about 10 minutes, and that's how long we want to let these preheat, it'll stabilize that temperature right around that 270, 280 degree range, and that's okay. So we're going to let this heat for 10 minutes. These have sat for a little while, so that's okay. So I'm going to do one additional coating. Then we're going to let that sit for an additional 5 minutes, which is great because this thing needs to heat up for an additional 5 minutes. While all that's heating up, one thing that you want to kind of keep in mind is the size and shape of your plastic. So the injection port here is not incredibly large, and so you do want to make sure that as you're processing your plastic, that you are getting relatively small pieces. So if you get really large pieces, it's going to be hard, or it's going to actually stick out of the injection port. And so do make sure that everything you have is, probably no bigger than, something like that size or much smaller. It'll heat up quicker, and it'll be a lot easier. If you have pieces like this, that's not going to work. So that's going to need to get chopped down into a much finer grain in order to be, successful with this. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our mold pieces out. You can feel that there's a very slippery coating. You want to avoid kind of as much contact on them as you can, but you'll notice that there's kind of a hazy coating on them now, and that's good. That's the mold release. So what we want to do is we're going to assemble our mold, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use packing tape to actually kind of keep everything tightly bound together. It's not what's going to apply the most amount of pressure. We're going to use our clamps for that. The packing tape is there just to keep things from sliding around too much on top of themselves. So again, we're going to put these together. We want to just be thoughtful about the orientation. Okay, so there's the three pieces together. So, and I'm just going to use a little bit of that painter's tape. I'm just going to make sure everything is nice and tightly lined up. And I'm just going to use that to bind it together. Now I want to be very careful that I don't actually plug up my injection hole with tape. That would be bad, and we wouldn't be able to actually get the plastic into it. Okay. But at this point you can see that my three sections are tightly taped together. I've got the opening for my hole there, And what I can do next is I can take our injection port, and the center hole here, this is going to screw into our plastic mold injector, and it's going to come out and be extruded through this small hole. So as I want to attach this here, but I want to make sure that these two holes line up. It may not fit perfectly center on here, and so the important bit is that as you're kind of looking through it, that you can see how the hole is perfectly lined up with that. So once you have that, then what you want to do is you want to go ahead and grab your clamps, and we're going to apply light pressure. You don't want to break your acrylic mold, but you want it to be on there, okay? And we're going to go ahead and clamp down on all the solid areas to keep this attached to the mold. Now notice how I'm doing all the short ends here. You want the long pointing ends to be pointing out in that direction, because you don't want these pointing toward the injection molder. So when it goes on, you have as much clearance on this side as you possibly can. Okay, so at this point you can see how we've clamped it all down. So we've got them all facing the same way. Okay, and what we're ultimately going to do is we're going to attach that onto the end there as soon as we're done heating up. Okay, so we've got our mold all set up and clamped. And so what we're going to begin doing is we're going to begin loading plastic into the injector. And so I'm going to go ahead and throw on one of these gloves because I'm going to be kind of working in close proximity here. And my goal is I'm going to be loading up this plastic in batches. And so we're going to pour in a small amount of plastic, and then we're actually going to load it by injecting it kind of further down the barrel so it can begin heating up. And then we're going to retract the barrel and load it. So I'm just going to kind of pinch my thing here. And I'm just going to begin. You can use your screwdriver to kind of push it down. If you get any large pieces, helping them work their way in. You would like to avoid as much mess as you can. And so if you get any pieces on the outside of the barrel, try to just get in there with the screwdriver and kick it off as much as you can. So we're just, once you get a good bit in there, that's why it's good to have small pieces, because when you do, this process goes much, much quicker. If you have big pieces, then it's tricky to keep shoving them all down. Okay, so I've got a good bit in there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over, and on the toggle switch, I'm going to flip it up. Push it down a few inches. And then toggle it down. Okay. And then repeat the process. Let that sit for about 10 minutes to get it all nice and molten-y. While that heats up, what I can do is spend a little bit of time just kind of cleaning up any of the spills that I had. Again, careful, this entire metal area is hot, so as you're kind of cleaning up or poking around, just make sure that you're protecting your hands. So we're gonna let that heat up for about 10 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes, and what we can actually see is we can see some plastic actually melting here on the nozzle, and that's actually good because that means that that heat is reaching down to this nozzle and heating everything up. So the process we're going to go through, and I'm going to talk through it before I actually do it, is we're going to unscrew this cap, and hopefully what we should be able to see is that there's just melty, gooey plastic in there. So we're going to pull that cap off. We're going to replace it with our mold. We're going to screw that on as best as we can, and then we're going to turn the injector on, and we're going to inject that plastic down into it. There's probably going to be some air there to start with, and that's okay because we put those little plastic caps on the bottom here, and that's going to allow the air to escape while the plastic kind of fills all the crevices. And so if for some reason we open this up and the plastic doesn't look melted, we're going to replace this cap and let it heat up for another 5 or 10 minutes. If it is melted, we don't want everything just to kind of spill out the end. And so we're going to have to kind of work, somewhat quickly to get this off and get this screwed on. Okay, so we're about ready to go on. But before you do make one final quick check on your clamps. What you want to make sure is that you have not blocked any of the air holes on the bottom with either your tape or your clamp. Now, when I was about to do this, I had noticed that I had both taped over some of the air holes and clamped over some of them. So I had to kind of take a quick break to tear away some of that tape and reposition my clamps. So do double check to make sure that you actually have air holes, because otherwise you're going to get air trapped in your mold and it's not going to turn out right. Also, make sure that you've got enough room around this incoming port so that your clamps aren't getting caught on the mold injector itself. So we're about ready to go. I think this is going to be warm enough. It should be easy to kind of screw this off and on. If not, you can always use the channel locks to be able to loosen that up. But this should be warm enough that it should just come off. So we're going to give this a shot. Hopefully it works well. Okay, so it does look very goopy. So I'm going to just gently thread this on. Okay, and it doesn't have to be super tight, but it shouldn't be loose. Okay, and I'm going to inject this in. Okay, and we see that it's kind of poured out the edges. That's good. I'm going to back it up just a hair. Okay, not all the way, but just a hair. And we'll let that sit there and cool down for just a quick second, maybe about 10 seconds. Okay, so it's been about 10 seconds. We're going to unscrew this and we're going to recap our edge. You may have to hold on to this. Again, you want to make sure that you are for sure wearing gloves during this part. You do not want to get hot plastic on your skin. It will not come off. It's like napalm. Okay, so just kind of slowly unwind until it comes free, and we're going to replace that cap as soon as it's free. So that comes off. And we can put that back on. Okay. Now what you can see is we got some coming out through those portholes. You can also see that I got some spilling out the side. Now what that means is that I probably need to clamp this along that edge to prevent the plastic from spilling out over that side. So I'm going to let this cool down for just a little bit. We're going to demold, and then your goal is to do 3 molds. And so we're going to try that again and see what our best of the 3 is going to be. Okay, so while that's going on, you can actually leave the mold injector on just to keep that plastic nice and hot. So we're going to demold this, come back, and try it again.
That looked good.
So we just finished our second injection mold. For this one, you can see I added a lot more clamps just to give it some additional clamping pressure. So I'm going to demold that and put it over here to cool down. And we're going to replace our mold cap. And again, wear gloves. You don't want hot mold. molten plastic all over your fingers. So we're going to plug that back up. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we relieve the pressure out as much as we can. So go ahead and pull this back. Okay, and if you're going to do another mold, you don't have to have it all the way back, but bring it back and then just go ahead and just barely close up, maybe an inch or two to keep all that heat inside. So we're going to close it up just a little bit, just about an inch or two. Okay, and that'll keep everything inside nice and warm while you wait for your mold to cool down and get it cleared out, demolded, and go again. So I'm going to let this sit for about 5 minutes. That's nice because it'll let the plastic heat back up again. But we're going to let this sit for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to go through and actually get it all demolded and cleaned up. Okay, so we're off of our second mold, and what you can see is that we have the air pocket, or the air gaps work perfectly. So we got a little bit of spillage on those, but that just literally just pops right off as soon as it's cooled. Now you do want to kind of be careful about how soon you demold. You don't want to demold when it's still really warm. It will cool from the outside in, and so it may look like it's all dried on the outside, but it's possible that it's still kind of warm and gooey on the inside. And so do be careful about how quickly you demold. I'm just going to kind of give it a small little twist and pop that out. What we can do on this side is come in and just clean and chip this away. You may find it helpful to have, even like a small screwdriver to kind of, push out any of these pieces, but we do want to make sure that we leave all this in, good condition for the next person who's going to come through and do the lab. And so I'm going to kind of work my way through here and just pop that out. So that should be nice and clean. Okay, on this part, so we should be able to begin to demold our pieces. Now this can be a really kind of delicate and tricky process because if you've got any plastic in between your layers, that's going to kind of make it tricky to demold. And so this is a process that you're going to just kind of take your time with, make sure that you don't tear apart your mold. These interior pieces you may find will pop off. That's okay. You can always re-glue them. You just want to make sure you don't actually like shatter or crack your mold. Otherwise you're going to have to go and redo them in the laser cutter. So I'm just going to kind of work my way around and just carefully try to like pry this part out. After you get it out, you can take an Injector knife and just trim off any of the flashing pieces, any of these kind of edge pieces that are coming off, just to try to kind of clean up the overall design. So you can see it took quite a bit of force to get that out, and ended up getting a couple of hairline cracks here and had this small part pop out. So that's okay. To fix that, again, you can just realign everything and glue it back in like we did in a previous step. But once you get your piece out, go ahead and inspect it. I got some small hairline cracks here, and that's okay because we can use just a little bit of glue to put those back together. And we just want to come around these edges and just very lightly. You don't want to gouge the plastic at all, but you do want to use a X-Acto or utility knife just to get that little bit of flashing off the edge and restore the piece to its final form. So that's where you want to get to. Again, just be careful with demolding. It can be really tricky, and try to get as best of a final finish on your pieces as you can. So, and that's it.